The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training grounds as Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her vehicle. The crisp air filled her lungs as she surveyed the scene before her. Dozens of new recruits stood in formation, their faces a mixture of determination and nervousness. This was her first day as the new training instructor at Fort Harrison, and she knew the importance of making a strong first impression. Sarah had arrived early, wanting to observe the recruits before they knew she was watching. She positioned herself near the administrative building, partially hidden by a concrete pillar. Her keen eyes studied each young face, noting their posture, their attention to detail, and their interactions with one another. The recruits came from all walks of life. Some were fresh out of high school, their faces still carrying the softness of youth. Others were older, perhaps seeking a new direction in life or answering a call to serve their country. There were men and women of various ethnicities, all united by their decision to join the military. Among them stood Private Jake Morrison, a 20-year-old from a small town in Texas. Jake had been the star quarterback of his high school football team, accustomed to being the center of attention and admiration. His confidence bordered on arrogance, and he had quickly established himself as the unofficial leader among the male recruits. Jake's piercing blue eyes scanned his fellow recruits with a mixture of assessment and judgment. He had already formed opinions about who would succeed and who would fail. In his mind, military service was about strength, toughness, and the ability to intimidate others when necessary. As the recruits continued their morning routine, Sarah decided it was time to introduce herself. She straightened her uniform and walked toward the group with purposeful strides. Her boots clicked against the asphalt with military precision, drawing the attention of several recruits. "Attention!" barked Sergeant Williams, the drill instructor who had been overseeing the morning assembly. The recruits immediately snapped to attention, their spines rigid and their eyes focused straight ahead. Sarah approached the formation and positioned herself in front of the group. She stood silently for a moment, allowing the weight of her presence to settle over the recruits. Her uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp and every insignia perfectly positioned. "Good morning, recruits," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the training ground. "I am Captain Mitchell, and I will be one of your primary training instructors during your time here at Fort Harrison." The recruits remained at attention, but Sarah could sense their curiosity. She knew they were trying to assess her, just as she had been assessing them moments earlier. "Over the next 12 weeks, you will be tested in ways you cannot imagine," Sarah continued. "You will discover strengths you didn't know you had, and you will confront weaknesses you've been avoiding. Some of you will rise to the challenge, and unfortunately, some of you will not." Jake listened to her words with a mixture of respect and skepticism. He had expected their instructors to be intimidating, but Captain Mitchell seemed different somehow. There was something about her demeanor that suggested she had seen real action, not just theoretical military scenarios. "Your training will begin immediately," Sarah announced. "You will learn weapons handling, tactical maneuvers, survival techniques, and most importantly, you will learn to work as a team. The military is not about individual heroes. It's about units functioning as one cohesive force." As Sarah spoke, she began walking along the front row of recruits, making eye contact with each one. Her presence was commanding, yet not aggressive. She had learned through experience that respect was more valuable than fear. When she reached the end of the first row, she turned and began walking back toward the center of the formation. It was then that Jake got his first clear look at the left side of her face and neck. Running from her ear down to her collar were several thin, irregular scars. They were not immediately obvious from a distance, but up close they were clearly visible. The scars appeared to be from some kind of explosive or fire damage, and they had healed into pale, slightly raised lines against her skin. Jake's eyes widened slightly as he noticed the scars. He had not expected to see such visible evidence of combat on any of his instructors. Most of the military personnel he had encountered during his recruitment process had been administrative types, with clean uniforms and unmarked faces. The sight of Sarah's scars triggered a complex mix of emotions in Jake. Part of him was genuinely impressed and curious about what had caused them. Another part of him, however, was uncomfortable with the idea of taking orders from someone who appeared to have been wounded in combat. In Jake's limited worldview, scars represented failure or weakness. He had grown up believing that successful soldiers were invincible, that they completed their missions without getting hurt. The Hollywood movies he had watched and the video games he had played had reinforced this misconception. Sarah completed her initial address to the recruits and dismissed them for their first training exercise. As the formation broke up, the recruits began moving toward the equipment storage area, where they would be issued gear for the day's activities. Jake found himself walking alongside his bunkmate, Private Tommy Chen, a quiet young man from California who had joined the military to earn money for college. "Did you see those scars on the captain's face?" Jake whispered to Tommy as they walked. Tommy glanced around nervously, unsure if he should be engaging in such a conversation. "Yeah, I noticed them," he replied quietly. "Makes you wonder what happened to her," Jake continued, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Doesn't exactly inspire confidence, you know. I mean, if she couldn't protect herself, how's she going to teach us to stay safe?" Tommy felt uncomfortable with Jake's tone, but didn't know how to respond. He had been raised to respect authority figures, especially military personnel, and Jake's comments seemed inappropriate. Other recruits nearby began to overhear fragments of Jake's conversation. Some looked shocked by his audacity, while others seemed curious about what he was saying. She had joined the military following in the footsteps of her father, who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. She understood that scars were often badges of honor, not sources of shame. "Maybe you should keep your opinions to yourself," Lisa said firmly, her voice low but clear. Jake turned toward her with a smirk. "Just making an observation," he replied. "I thought our instructors were supposed to be examples of military excellence. Hard to see how someone who's been all carved up fits that description." The group of recruits had now reached the equipment storage area, where Sergeant Williams was waiting to issue gear. The conversation died down as they focused on receiving their assignments for the day. Sarah, meanwhile, was in the administrative building reviewing the personnel files of her new recruits. She had made it a practice to learn as much as possible about each individual under her command. Understanding their backgrounds, motivations, and potential challenges helped her tailor her training approach. She paused when she reached Jake Morrison's file. His test scores were impressive, and his physical fitness evaluation placed him in the top 10% of incoming recruits. However, there were some concerning notes from his preliminary interviews. One interviewer had noted that Jake displayed excessive confidence and seemed to have unrealistic expectations about military service. Another had written that he may struggle with authority if he perceives weakness in commanding officers. Sarah made a mental note to keep a close eye on Private Morrison. She had encountered his type before, young men who came into the military with preconceived notions about what it meant to be a soldier. Often these recruits required the most significant attitude adjustments. The morning's first training exercise was basic weapons familiarization. Sarah led the group to the indoor firing range, where they would learn to safely handle and operate standard military firearms. As the recruits filed into the range, Sarah noticed Jake positioning himself near the front of the group. His body language suggested he expected to excel at this particular activity. "Today we will begin your weapons training," Sarah announced as the recruits assembled. "Before anyone touches a firearm, you will learn the fundamental safety rules that will keep you and your fellow soldiers alive." She proceeded to explain the basic principles of weapon safety, emphasizing the importance of treating every weapon as if it were loaded, never pointing a muzzle at anything you didn't intend to destroy, and keeping your finger off the trigger until ready to shoot. Jake listened impatiently, convinced that he already knew everything he needed to know about firearms. He had grown up hunting with his father and considered himself an excellent marksman. When Sarah began demonstrating proper shooting stance and grip, Jake whispered to the recruit next to him, "This is pretty basic stuff. I could probably teach this class better than someone who's been shot at and hit." His comment was louder than he had intended, and several nearby recruits heard it clearly. Lisa Rodriguez again shot him a warning look, while Tommy Chen seemed to shrink away from his bunkmate. Sarah heard the comment but chose not to address it immediately. She had learned that sometimes it was more effective to allow recruits to reveal their true character through their actions rather than their words. The training session continued with each recruit taking turns at the firing line under close supervision. Sarah moved among them, offering individual instruction and making corrections to their technique. When Jake's turn came, he approached the firing line with obvious confidence. He assumed what he believed to be a perfect shooting stance and prepared to demonstrate his superior skills. However, military marksmanship is significantly different from recreational shooting. The stance, breathing techniques, and mental approach required for military accuracy are more demanding than what most civilians experience. Jake's first few shots missed the target entirely. He looked confused and slightly embarrassed as he tried to adjust his technique. His confidence began to waver as shot after shot failed to hit where he was aiming. Sarah approached him quietly. "Private Morrison, relax your shoulders and focus on your breathing," she instructed. Military shooting is about consistency and discipline, not raw talent. He had expected to impress his fellow recruits and his instructor with his shooting skills. Instead, he was struggling with what he had assumed would be his strongest area. As the session continued, other recruits began to show improvement under Sarah's guidance. Lisa Rodriguez, who had never fired a weapon before joining the military, quickly grasped the fundamentals and began hitting the target consistently. Tommy Chen, despite his quiet demeanor, demonstrated excellent focus and shot a respectable group of holes near the center of his target. Even some of the recruits who seemed physically less impressive than Jake were outperforming him significantly. By the end of the session, Jake's ego had taken a substantial hit. He had not only failed to excel, but had actually performed worse than many recruits he had initially dismissed as inferior. As they cleaned up the firing range and prepared to move to the next training area, Jake found himself walking near Sarah. His frustration got the better of his judgment, and he decided to voice his thoughts. "Captain, can I ask you something?" he said, trying to sound respectful despite his inner turmoil. Sarah looked at him with neutral expression. "What's on your mind, Private Morrison?" Jake hesitated for a moment, then forged ahead. "I was just wondering, those scars on your face, were you wounded in combat?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but she could sense where this conversation was heading. "Yes, Private Morrison. I was injured while serving overseas." Jake nodded, emboldened by her direct answer. "It's just that, I guess I'm trying to understand how someone who got hurt is qualified to teach us how not to get hurt. No disrespect intended, but shouldn't our instructors be people who successfully completed their missions without getting wounded?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several nearby recruits had overheard Jake's words and were watching to see how Sarah would respond. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face Jake directly. Her eyes met his with an intensity that made him immediately regret his decision to speak. "Private Morrison," she said in a calm but firm voice, "your question reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service actually involves." Jake felt his face flush as he realized he had crossed a line. But Sarah wasn't finished. "You seem to believe that getting wounded in combat is a sign of failure or incompetence. Let me correct that misconception right now." Her voice remained controlled, but there was an edge to it that commanded absolute attention from everyone within earshot. Soldiers don't get wounded because they make mistakes, or because they're weak. They get wounded because they put themselves in harm's way to complete missions and protect their fellow service members. Jake wanted to respond, but something in Sarah's demeanor warned him to remain silent. "The scars you see are not evidence of failure, Private Morrison. They are evidence of service. They represent a willingness to sacrifice for something greater than oneself." Sarah paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "Over the course of your training, you will learn that courage is not the absence of fear or the ability to avoid danger. Courage is the willingness to face danger despite your fear, and to continue your mission even when you've been hurt." The training ground had grown quiet, as other recruits and even some passing instructors had stopped to listen to Sarah's response. Furthermore, Sarah continued, "You will discover that the most valuable lessons often come from those who have faced real adversity and overcome it. Theory is useful, but experience is irreplaceable." Jake felt smaller with each word Sarah spoke. His assumptions about military service were being systematically dismantled, and he was beginning to realize how naive his worldview had been. "Now, Private Morrison, do you have any other questions about my qualifications to serve as your instructor?" Jake shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am." "I apologize for my inappropriate comment." Sarah nodded once. "Apology accepted. Use this as a learning opportunity, Private Morrison. In the military, we don't judge people by their scars, we judge them by their character and their willingness to serve." As the group resumed walking toward their next training area, Jake found himself isolated from his fellow recruits. Many of them looked at him with disappointment or disgust, clearly unimpressed by his behavior. Lisa Rodriguez fell into step beside him. "That was really stupid." she said bluntly. Tommy Chen, despite his usual reluctance to confront anyone, also seemed disappointed in his bunkmate. My dad always told me that scars are proof someone survived something that tried to kill them, he said quietly. Jake realized that his attempt to establish himself as a leader among the recruits had backfired spectacularly. Instead of appearing strong and discerning, he had revealed himself to be judgmental and ignorant. The remainder of the training day passed without further incident, but Jake could feel the weight of his fellow recruits' disapproval. During meals, conversations would stop when he approached tables. During free time, others seemed to avoid him. That evening, as the recruits prepared for lights out, Jake lay in his bunk reflecting on the day's events. He had entered military service expecting to excel immediately and perhaps even impress his instructors with his natural abilities. Instead, he had struggled with basic marksmanship and alienated both his peers and his commanding officer with his insensitive comments. For the first time since arriving at Fort Harrison, Jake began to question his assumptions about what it meant to be a soldier. He had grown up with images of invincible warriors who never failed and never got hurt. Captain Mitchell's scars and her response to his question had shattered those illusions. Real soldiers, it seemed, were not immune to danger or pain. They were people who faced both and continued serving anyway. As Jake drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the image of Sarah's steady gaze as she had corrected his misguided beliefs. There was something in her eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond his understanding. He didn't yet know the full story behind those scars, but he was beginning to suspect that Captain Mitchell had earned them in ways that would humble his teenage arrogance even further. The night passed quietly, but Jake's real education was just beginning. The following morning brought new challenges for the recruits at Fort Harrison. Jake Morrison woke before dawn, his sleep having been restless and filled with uncomfortable thoughts about the previous day's events. The barracks were quiet except for the soft breathing of his fellow recruits, most of whom were still sleeping peacefully. Jake stared at the ceiling in the dim light filtering through the windows. He couldn't stop thinking about Captain Mitchell's response to his question about her scars. Her words had hit him harder than any physical blow, and he was beginning to realize how much he didn't understand about military service. As the wake-up call echoed through the barracks, the recruits began stirring. Jake noticed that several of his bunkmates avoided making eye contact with him as they prepared for the day. Word of his confrontation with Captain Mitchell had spread quickly through the ranks, and his reputation had taken a significant hit. Tommy Chen, who had been friendly since their arrival, now seemed distant and cautious around Jake. The easy camaraderie they had begun to develop had evaporated overnight. "Morning," Jake said quietly to Tommy as they made their beds according to military standards. Tommy nodded politely, but didn't engage in conversation. The message was clear. Jake's behavior had disappointed even those who had been willing to befriend him. Lisa Rodriguez, meanwhile, had become something of a folk hero among the female recruits for her direct confrontation of Jake's inappropriate comments. She carried herself with increased confidence, knowing that she had stood up for what was right even when it was uncomfortable. As the recruits assembled for morning formation, Captain Mitchell appeared with her usual punctuality and professional bearing. She showed no lingering effects from the previous day's incident, treating all recruits with the same measured respect and authority. Jake found himself studying her more carefully than before. Now that he knew about her combat experience, he began to notice other subtle details that suggested her background was more extensive than he had initially realized. Her posture was that of someone who had learned to remain constantly alert. Her eyes frequently scanned the environment, not nervously, but with the practiced awareness of someone who had operated in dangerous situations. When she spoke to the group, her voice carried the confidence of someone who had commanded troops under pressure. These weren't the mannerisms of a career instructor who had never seen real action. "Today we will focus on tactical movement and teamwork," Captain Mitchell announced to the assembled recruits. "You will learn to move as a unit, communicate effectively under stress, and trust your fellow soldiers with your safety." She gestured toward an obstacle course that had been set up overnight. It consisted of various barriers, walls, trenches, and simulated urban environments that the recruits would need to navigate together. "This exercise is not about individual performance," she continued. "It is about learning to function as a team. You will succeed or fail together." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. Team exercises had always been challenging for him, because they required him to trust others and sometimes follow rather than lead. His natural inclination was to take charge and do things his own way. The recruits were divided into squads of 8 members each. Jake found himself assigned to a squad with Tommy, Lisa, and 5 other recruits he hadn't interacted with extensively. As they gathered to receive their specific instructions, Jake could sense the reluctance of his squad members to work with him. His reputation from the previous day had preceded him, and they viewed him as potentially disruptive. Lisa, who had been designated as the squad leader for this exercise, addressed the group with natural authority. "Okay, everyone," she said, "we need to approach this as a team. That means communication, cooperation, and checking our egos at the door." Her eyes lingered on Jake as she spoke, making her message unmistakably clear. The first obstacle was a series of walls of varying heights that required the squad to help each other climb over. Some walls were low enough for most recruits to manage alone, while others required teamwork and coordination. As they approached the first high wall, Lisa began organizing their approach. "Tommy and Jake, you're the tallest. I want you to boost the others up, then we'll pull you over from the top." Jake nodded, recognizing the logic of her plan. However, as they began executing the maneuver, his impatience began to show. "Come on, move faster," he muttered to one of the smaller recruits who was struggling to reach the top. "We're losing time. Focus on helping, not criticizing," she said firmly. As the exercise continued, Jake's competitive nature repeatedly clashed with the collaborative approach required for success. He found himself frustrated when other squad members needed extra assistance or moved more slowly than he preferred. During one particularly challenging obstacle that required the entire squad to crawl through a narrow tunnel while carrying equipment, Jake's impatience boiled over. "This is ridiculous," he complained as one recruit became momentarily stuck. "In real combat, we can't afford to wait for everyone to catch up." Lisa had heard enough. She stopped the squad and turned to face Jake directly. "Listen, Morrison," she said, using his last name to emphasize the seriousness of her tone. "You clearly don't understand what real combat is about. It's not about individual heroes running ahead of everyone else." The other squad members gathered around, sensing that a confrontation was about to occur. "In real combat," Lisa continued, "leaving people behind gets them killed. And getting your teammates killed is the fastest way to fail your mission." Jake felt his anger rising. Being lectured by a female recruit who had probably never even fired a gun before joining the military was more than his ego could handle. "And what makes you such an expert on combat?" he shot back. "At least I've been around weapons my entire life. I've been hunting since I was 12 years old." Lisa's expression didn't change, but her voice took on a colder tone. "Hunting animals is not combat, Morrison. And if you think your hunting experience makes you qualified to judge Captain Mitchell's combat record, you're even more clueless than I thought." Other squads working nearby had begun to notice the confrontation. Some stopped their own exercises to watch what was happening. Tommy Chen, who rarely spoke up during conflicts, surprised everyone by stepping forward. "Jake," he said quietly, "maybe you should just listen for once, instead of always trying to prove how much you know." The words stung because they came from someone Jake had considered a friend. The realization that he had alienated even Tommy forced Jake to confront how his behavior was affecting everyone around him. Before Jake could respond, Captain Mitchell appeared beside their squad. She had been monitoring all the groups and had noticed the disruption. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice neutral but commanding immediate attention. Lisa straightened to attention. "Ma'am, we're just working through some squad coordination issues." Sarah looked at each member of the squad, her experienced eyes reading the tension and frustration on their faces. She had dealt with similar situations countless times and knew exactly what was happening. "Private Morrison," she said, "step aside with me for a moment." Jake's heart began racing. He had no desire for another confrontational conversation with Captain Mitchell, especially in front of his squad members. They walked a few yards away from the group, far enough to speak privately, but close enough that Jake remained visible to the others. "Private Morrison," Sarah began, "you seem to be struggling with the concept of teamwork. Would you like to explain to me what's causing your difficulties?" Jake looked down at his boots, unsure how to respond without digging himself into a deeper hole. "I guess I'm just used to doing things on my own," he said finally. "I've always been pretty self-sufficient." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Self-sufficiency is a valuable quality, Private Morrison, but in the military, Absolute self-sufficiency is actually a liability.
There is no higher than this type of course.
She gestured toward the obstacle course around them. These exercises are designed to break down your instinct to operate alone. In combat, soldiers who try to be heroes usually end up dead or getting their teammates killed. Jake looked up at her, beginning to sense that this conversation was heading somewhere important. You mentioned yesterday that you question the qualifications of people who have been wounded in combat, Sarah continued. Let me share something with you that might change your perspective. The scars you see on my face came from an incident in Afghanistan. My unit was conducting a rescue operation to extract wounded soldiers from a compound that was under heavy enemy fire. Jake found himself listening intently despite his discomfort. During the extraction, an improvised explosive device detonated near my position. The shrapnel that caused these scars also temporarily blinded me and damaged my hearing. Sarah's voice remained steady and factual, showing no self-pity or dramatic emotion. Despite my injuries, my team and I continued the mission. We successfully extracted all the wounded soldiers and returned them safely to base. Not a single American life was lost during that operation. Jake felt a growing sense of shame as he began to understand the magnitude of his earlier comments. The point, Private Morrison, is that those scars represent a successful mission, not a failure. They represent a willingness to sacrifice for others, which is the foundation of military service. She looked directly into his eyes, ensuring he understood the importance of what she was saying. Your hunting experience and your individual physical abilities are assets, but they mean nothing if you can't work with a team. The strongest soldier in the world is useless if his teammates can't trust him. Jake nodded, finally beginning to grasp the scope of his misunderstanding. I want you to return to your squad and complete this exercise, Sarah instructed. But this time, I want you to focus entirely on helping others succeed. Don't worry about your own performance. Make sure everyone else completes the course successfully. As Jake walked back toward his squad, he felt a profound shift in his thinking. For the first time since arriving at Fort Harrison, he was beginning to understand that military service was fundamentally different from anything he had experienced in civilian life. His squad members watched him approach with cautious curiosity. They could see that something had changed during his conversation with Captain Mitchell, but they weren't sure what to expect. Okay, Jake said quietly to Lisa. What do you need me to do? Lisa studied his face for a moment, looking for signs of sarcasm or resentment. Finding none, she decided to give him another chance. We're still struggling with the rope climb, she said. We need someone strong enough to go up first and secure the line for the others. Jake nodded and moved toward the rope without argument or complaint. As he climbed, he focused not on his own speed or technique, but on making sure the rope was positioned correctly for the teammates who would follow. When he reached the top, instead of immediately dropping down to the other side, he spent extra time securing the rope and testing its stability. Okay, it's ready, he called down to his squad. Lisa, you want to come up first and I'll help guide the others? The change in Jake's demeanor was noticeable to everyone. He was no longer trying to prove his superiority or criticize others' performance. Instead, he was genuinely focused on helping the team succeed. As each squad member climbed the rope, Jake offered encouragement and assistance. When one recruit struggled with upper body strength, Jake didn't express impatience or frustration. Instead, he coached them through the technique and celebrated their success when they reached the top. Tommy Chen, who had been watching Jake's transformation with interest, began to warm up to his bunkmate again. He could see that Jake was making a genuine effort to change his approach. The squad's performance improved dramatically once Jake began cooperating fully. They completed the remaining obstacles with increasing efficiency and confidence. During the final obstacle, a simulated building clearing exercise, Jake demonstrated his new understanding by consistently deferring to Lisa's leadership and ensuring that no one was left behind. As they finished the course, the squad members found themselves genuinely pleased with their collective performance. Even those who had been most critical of Jake earlier in the day acknowledged that he had made a significant contribution to their success. Captain Mitchell observed their completion of the exercise with professional satisfaction. She had seen Jake's transformation during the course and recognized it as a breakthrough moment in his development. When the squads reassembled for debriefing, Sarah addressed the entire group about the lessons of the day. Today you learned that individual strength means nothing without teamwork, she said. You also learned that leadership is not about being the loudest or most aggressive person in the group. She looked around at the faces of the recruits, noting their fatigue but also their sense of accomplishment. Real leadership in the military is about enabling others to succeed and ensuring that everyone completes the mission safely. Jake found himself nodding along with her words, finally understanding concepts that had been foreign to him just hours earlier. As the day concluded and the recruits prepared for evening meal, Jake approached Lisa privately. "I wanted to apologize for being such a jerk earlier," he said. "You were right about everything, and I should have listened instead of arguing." Lisa studied him for a moment before responding. "Apology accepted," she said. "But remember, actions matter more than words. Show me that you've actually learned something." Jake nodded, understanding that rebuilding trust would require consistent positive behavior over time. That evening, as Jake reflected on the day's events, he realized that his entire understanding of strength and leadership had been turned upside down. Captain Mitchell's scars, which he had initially viewed as signs of weakness, now represented something entirely different. They were evidence of courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to put others before oneself. These were qualities Jake was only beginning to understand, let alone develop within himself. As he prepared for sleep, Jake made a silent commitment to approach the remainder of his training with a completely different mindset. He would focus on becoming the kind of soldier who could be trusted by his teammates rather than trying to prove his individual superiority. The transformation had begun, but Jake was only starting to understand how much he still had to learn about what it truly meant to serve. 3 weeks had passed since Jake Morrison's initial confrontation with Captain Mitchell, and the transformation in his behavior had been remarkable. The young recruit who had once mocked his instructor's scars was now one of the most dedicated and cooperative members of his training class. Jake had thrown himself into learning everything he could about military service. He studied tactical manuals during his free time, practiced marksmanship until his shoulders ached, and most importantly, focused on becoming a reliable teammate. His relationship with his fellow recruits had improved significantly. Tommy Chen had become a genuine friend again, and even Lisa Rodriguez had begun to trust his judgment during training exercises. The other members of their squad no longer viewed him as a liability or potential troublemaker. Captain Mitchell had observed Jake's progress with professional interest. She had seen many recruits struggle with the transition from civilian to military mindset, and Jake's transformation was particularly noteworthy because of how far he had come. However, Sarah knew that Jake's real test would come during the advanced training phases, when the pressure increased and the stakes became more realistic. It was one thing to cooperate during basic exercises. It was another to maintain that discipline when facing genuine stress and danger. The morning of the 4th week brought an announcement that would challenge all the recruits in ways they hadn't yet experienced. "Today begins your field training exercise," Captain Mitchell announced as the recruits assembled in full combat gear. "For the next 72 hours, you will operate as military units in a simulated combat environment." She gestured toward a convoy of vehicles that would transport them to the training area several miles from the base. "You will be divided into 2 companies and given opposing objectives. This exercise will test everything you have learned about tactics, teamwork, communication, and leadership under pressure." Jake felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This would be his first opportunity to apply his military training in a realistic scenario, and he was eager to prove that he had truly changed. "The exercise will be monitored by instructors and evaluated using advanced simulation technology," Sarah continued. "Your performance will directly impact your final training scores and your eventual military assignments." As the recruits boarded the transport vehicles, Jake found himself seated next to a recruit named Marcus Williams, a quiet young man from Detroit who had consistently performed well in all training areas. "You nervous?" Marcus asked as the convoy began moving toward the training area. Jake considered the question honestly. "Yeah, a little," he admitted, "but also excited. I feel like everything we've been learning is finally going to make sense." Marcus nodded. "I heard you had some rough moments early on, but you've really turned it around. People notice stuff like that." Jake appreciated the acknowledgement but also felt the weight of maintaining his improved reputation. He knew that one bad decision during the field exercise could undo weeks of progress. The training area was a vast expanse of varied terrain that included forests, open fields, simulated urban environments, and natural obstacles like streams and hills. It had been designed to replicate the types of environments where real military operations might take place. As the recruits disembarked from their vehicles, they were immediately sorted into their respective companies and given their mission briefings. Jake found himself assigned to Alpha Company, with Lisa Rodriguez as one of his squad leaders and Tommy Chen as a member of his fire team. Captain Mitchell and several other instructors positioned themselves at observation posts throughout the training area. They would monitor the exercise using radio communications and direct observation, but would not intervene unless safety became a concern. Alpha Company, announced Lieutenant Morrison, the officer in charge of Jake's unit, your mission is to secure and hold the communications facility at grid reference 247139. Bravo Company will be attempting to capture the same facility. Jake studied the map they had been provided, noting the terrain features and potential routes to their objective. The communications facility was a mock installation consisting of several buildings and radio towers positioned on elevated ground. We have 6 hours to reach the objective and establish defensive positions, Lieutenant Morrison continued. Once in position, we must hold the facility against Bravo Company's assault for 18 hours. The mission parameters were clear, but Jake knew that the execution would be far more complex than it appeared on paper. Real military operations rarely proceeded according to plan, and this exercise was designed to test their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. As Alpha Company began their movement toward the objective, Jake focused on fulfilling his role as a team member rather than trying to take charge. He had learned that effective military units function through discipline and clear chains of command, not individual initiative. His fire team leader was Corporal Jackson, an experienced instructor who would be evaluating their performance throughout the exercise. Jake made sure to listen carefully to Jackson's instructions and execute them precisely. The first challenge came when they encountered a simulated minefield blocking their intended route to the communications facility. The minefield was marked with training devices that would register hits if stepped on, effectively eliminating participants from the exercise. We need to find an alternative route, Corporal Jackson announced after studying the obstacle. Morrison, what do you see on the map? Jake examined their options carefully. There were 2 potential alternate routes, one that would take them through dense forest but add several hours to their travel time, and another that would require crossing exposed terrain but allow them to maintain their schedule. The forest route would be safer, but might cause us to arrive too late to establish good defensive positions, Jake reported. The exposed route is riskier but keeps us on timeline. Corporal Jackson nodded. What's your recommendation? Jake felt the weight of responsibility as he considered the decision. His old instincts told him to choose the aggressive option and rush across the open ground, but his training had taught him to think about the welfare of his entire unit. I think we should take the forest route, he said finally. Better to arrive safely and have time to dig in than to risk losing people in the open and arrive with a weakened force. Jackson smiled slightly. Good reasoning, Morrison. That's exactly the kind of tactical thinking we want to see. As they moved through the forest toward their objective, Jake found himself naturally falling into the rhythm of military movement. He maintained proper spacing from other team members, watched for threats, and communicated effectively using hand signals when radio silence was required. The forest route proved to be more challenging than expected. The terrain was difficult to navigate, with steep slopes, dense vegetation, and several stream crossings that slowed their progress significantly. During one particularly difficult stream crossing, one of the recruits in Jake's fire team, Private Anderson, slipped on wet rocks and twisted his ankle. In the simulation, this represented a casualty that would need to be managed according to military protocols. Anderson's down, Jake reported to Corporal Jackson. Looks like a sprained ankle. Jackson approached to assess the situation. In a real combat scenario, Anderson would need medical attention and possibly evacuation. In the training exercise, he could continue, but would be limited in his mobility. Morrison, I want you to assist Anderson for the remainder of our movement, Jackson instructed. Make sure he can keep up, but don't compromise the safety of the rest of the fire team. Jake nodded and moved to Anderson's side. The injured recruit was clearly in pain and embarrassed about slowing down the unit. Don't worry about it, Jake told him quietly. We'll get through this together. For the next 2 hours, Jake helped Anderson navigate the difficult terrain while maintaining awareness of their tactical situation. It was exhausting work, but Jake never complained or suggested that they should leave Anderson behind. His behavior during this phase of the exercise was observed by multiple instructors who noted his commitment to the welfare of his fellow soldier despite the personal cost. When Alpha Company finally reached the communications facility, they had only 90 minutes before Bravo Company was expected to begin their assault. This gave them very little time to establish defensive positions and prepare for the coming battle. Lieutenant Morrison quickly assessed their situation and began assigning defensive sectors to each squad. Jake's fire team was given responsibility for the northern approach, which intelligence suggested might be Bravo Company's primary avenue of attack. As they prepared their positions, Jake drew on everything he had learned about military tactics and defensive operations. He helped his team members dig fighting positions, establish fields of fire, and coordinate their communication procedures. Captain Mitchell, observing from a concealed position several hundred yards away, watched Jake's performance with interest. The recruit, who had once questioned her qualifications, was now demonstrating exactly the kind of leadership and tactical thinking that made effective soldiers. When Bravo Company's assault began, it came with an intensity that surprised many of the Alpha Company defenders. The attacking force used sophisticated tactics, including diversionary attacks and coordinated fire and movement techniques. Jake's fire team found themselves under immediate pressure as Bravo Company forces approached their sector. The simulation technology created realistic sounds of gunfire and explosions, adding stress and confusion to the exercise. "Contact north," Jake called out, following proper communication procedures. "Multiple enemy approaching through the tree line." His team members responded exactly as they had been trained, engaging the simulated enemy forces while maintaining communication with other defensive positions. During the firefight, Jake noticed that Private Anderson, still limited by his ankle injury, was having difficulty moving between positions as the tactical situation changed. Without hesitation, Jake moved to Anderson's position and helped him relocate to better cover. This action exposed Jake to simulated enemy fire, and the exercise computers registered multiple hits on his position. According to the exercise rules, Jake was now considered wounded and would have reduced capabilities for the remainder of the scenario. "Morrison's hit," Corporal Jackson announced. "Anderson, you need to take over his sector." Despite his simulated wounds, Jake continued to provide guidance and support to his team members. He helped coordinate their defensive efforts and maintained communication with other fire teams. The battle for the communications facility continued for several more hours, with both sides demonstrating tactical skill and determination. By the time the exercise concluded, both companies had learned valuable lessons about combat operations and military leadership. During the post-exercise debriefing, instructors reviewed the performance of individual recruits and discussed lessons learned from the training scenario. When it came time to discuss Jake's performance, Corporal Jackson had nothing but positive comments. "Private Morrison demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and sacrifice we expect from military personnel," he reported. "When faced with difficult decisions, he consistently chose the welfare of his unit over personal advancement." Lieutenant Morrison added his own observations. Morrison's tactical recommendations were sound, and his behavior under stress showed significant maturity. "This recruit has undergone a remarkable transformation during his training." Captain Mitchell listened to these reports with satisfaction, but also with knowledge that Jake still didn't possess. The young recruit had proven himself capable of growth and learning, but he still had no idea about the full extent of her own military background. As the recruits prepared to return to base for rest and recovery, Jake felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The field exercise had validated everything he had learned about military service and teamwork. More importantly, it had shown him that his transformation from arrogant individual to dedicated team member was genuine and complete. However, Jake still had much to learn about the woman who had guided that transformation. Captain Mitchell's scars were indeed evidence of her service in Afghanistan, but they represented only a small part of her military story. The real revelation about her background was yet to come, and when it did, it would fundamentally change Jake's understanding of what it meant to serve with distinction in the United States military. As the convoy returned to Fort Harrison, Jake found himself looking forward to the remaining weeks of training with genuine enthusiasm. He had discovered his true calling as a soldier, and he was eager to continue learning from the officers and instructors who were shaping his development. Captain Mitchell, meanwhile, was already planning the next phase of training that would further test the recruits' abilities and character. She had seen promising signs in many of them, but she knew that their ultimate test would come when they faced real challenges in actual military service. The field exercise had been just the beginning of their real education as soldiers. The weeks following the field training exercise had been a period of intensive learning and growth for Jake Morrison and his fellow recruits. As their basic training entered its final phase, the atmosphere at Fort Harrison had shifted from the initial uncertainty and competition to a sense of genuine camaraderie and shared purpose. Jake had emerged as an informal leader among the recruits, not through aggression or self-promotion, but through consistent demonstration of the values Captain Mitchell had tried to teach them. His transformation had been so complete that many of the newer instructors who arrived later in the training cycle had difficulty believing the stories about his early conflicts.
Tommy Chen often marveled at the change in his friend. "Sometimes I forget you're the same guy who argued with Captain Mitchell about her scars," he would say during their evening conversations.
Lisa Rodriguez, who had initially been Jake's harshest critic, now considered him one of the most reliable members of their training class. Their mutual respect had grown into a strong professional friendship that would likely continue throughout their military careers. Captain Mitchell had watched Jake's development with the satisfaction of an instructor who had successfully guided a struggling student toward success. However, she knew that the final test of any recruit's character came not during training exercises, but in real military operations, where lives actually hung in the balance. The approaching graduation ceremony would mark the end of basic training for the recruits, but it would also bring visitors from higher levels of the military command structure. Among those visitors would be individuals who knew Captain Mitchell's full story, and whose presence might reveal more about her background than she had chosen to share with her trainees. On a crisp morning in late November, Jake was participating in a leadership exercise when Sergeant Williams approached with an unusual request.
"Morrison," the drill sergeant said, "Captain Mitchell wants to see you in the administrative building. You're to report immediately." Jake felt a momentary flash of concern. Throughout his transformation, he had maintained an exemplary record, and he couldn't think of any reason why he might be in trouble. "Do you know what this is about, Sergeant?" he asked. Williams shook his head. "Just report as ordered, son, and make sure your uniform is squared away." As Jake made his way to the administrative building, he reviewed his recent performance in his mind. His grades were strong, his conduct had been exemplary, and his relationships with both instructors and fellow recruits were positive. He couldn't identify any issues that would warrant a private meeting. He knocked on Captain Mitchell's office door and waited for permission to enter. "Come in, Private Morrison," came Sarah's voice from inside. Jake entered and snapped to attention. "Private Morrison reporting as ordered, ma'am." Sarah looked up from the paperwork on her desk. She appeared to be reviewing his training records and evaluation reports. "At ease, Morrison," she said. "Please, have a seat." Jake sat down in the chair across from her desk, maintaining proper posture but trying to read her expression for clues about the purpose of this meeting. "I've been reviewing your progress throughout basic training," Sarah began. "Your transformation has been remarkable. You've gone from being one of our most challenging recruits to one of our strongest performers." Jake felt a sense of relief mixed with pride. "Thank you, ma'am. I've tried to learn from my mistakes and become the kind of soldier the Army needs." Sarah nodded. "Your instructors have consistently praised your leadership abilities and your commitment to your fellow soldiers. That's why I wanted to discuss your future with you." She pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be assignment options and career pathway information. "Based on your performance, you're being considered for several advanced training opportunities," she continued. "These would lead to specialized roles that require high levels of responsibility and trust." Jake leaned forward slightly, interested in learning more about these opportunities. "There's airborne training, which would qualify you for paratrooper units. There's also Ranger School, which is among the most challenging military training programs in existence." She paused, studying Jake's reaction to these possibilities. "There's also the option of Officer Candidate School, which would put you on the path to becoming a commissioned officer like myself." Jake was overwhelmed by the possibilities being presented to him. These were opportunities he never would have imagined having access to when he first arrived at Fort Harrison. "Ma'am, I'm honored that you would consider me for any of these programs," he said. "But I have to ask, do I really deserve these opportunities after how I behaved early in training?"
Sarah's expression softened slightly. This question demonstrated exactly the kind of humility and self-awareness that made Jake suitable for advanced responsibilities. Morrison, one of the most important qualities we look for in military leaders is the ability to learn from mistakes and grow from them, she said. Your early struggles don't disqualify you. In fact, they may actually make you a better leader because you understand how easy it is to fall into patterns of poor judgment. She leaned back in her chair, considering how to best explain the military's approach to leadership development. The Army doesn't need perfect soldiers, Morrison. We need soldiers who can adapt, learn, and help others do the same. Your experience gives you credibility with other young recruits who might be struggling with similar issues. Jake nodded, beginning to understand how his personal journey might actually be an asset in future assignments. Before you make any decisions about these opportunities, Sarah continued, there's something I want you to understand about military service and the responsibilities that come with leadership positions. She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds where other recruits were conducting their daily exercises. Leadership in the military isn't about being the toughest or most aggressive person in the room, she said. It's about making decisions that protect your soldiers and accomplish your mission, even when those decisions are difficult or dangerous. Jake remained silent, sensing that Captain Mitchell was building towards something important. Sometimes those decisions require personal sacrifice. Sometimes they require you to put yourself in harm's way to protect others. She turned back to face him, and Jake noticed something different in her expression. There was a weight there, a seriousness that suggested she was speaking from deep personal experience. The scars you commented on during your first week here represent exactly that kind of decision, she said quietly. Jake felt his face flush as he remembered his insensitive comments from months earlier. Ma'am, I owe you another apology for those remarks, he began, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. The apology isn't necessary, Morrison, but I think you should understand the full context of how I received those scars, because it illustrates the kind of responsibilities you'll face if you accept these advanced training opportunities. Sarah returned to her seat and looked directly at Jake. The incident in Afghanistan that I mentioned to you wasn't just a random attack or an accident, she began. It was the result of a deliberate decision I made to save the lives of my soldiers. Jake found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in what she was telling him. My unit was conducting a rescue operation in Helmand Province. We were extracting wounded American soldiers from a compound that was surrounded by enemy forces. Her voice took on the measured tone of someone recounting events that had been analyzed and reviewed countless times in official reports. During the extraction, we discovered that one of the wounded soldiers was trapped under debris from a collapsed wall. He was conscious but unable to move, and enemy forces were closing in on our position. Sarah paused, allowing Jake to visualize the dangerous situation she was describing. I had two choices: order my unit to withdraw and leave the trapped soldier behind, or risk additional casualties by staying to attempt a rescue. Jake realized he was holding his breath as he waited for her to continue. I chose to stay. I ordered most of my unit to establish a defensive perimeter, while I and 2 volunteers worked to free the trapped soldier. The weight of command responsibility was beginning to become clear to Jake. This wasn't about individual heroism. It was about making life-and-death decisions for an entire unit. While we were working to free him, an enemy grenade landed near our position. I had approximately 3 seconds to react. Sarah's voice remained steady, but Jake could see the intensity in her eyes as she relived the moment. I could have taken cover and protected myself, but that would have meant certain death for the trapped soldier, and probably for my 2 volunteers as well. Jake found himself imagining the split-second decision she had been forced to make. Instead, I threw myself over the trapped soldier to shield him from the blast. The shrapnel that caused these scars also damaged my vision and hearing temporarily, but all 3 of us survived. She gestured toward the faint lines on her face and neck that Jake had once viewed as signs of weakness. More importantly, we successfully extracted all the wounded soldiers from that compound. No American lives were lost during that operation. Jake sat in stunned silence as the full magnitude of Captain Mitchell's actions became clear to him. His original assumption that her scars represented failure or incompetence couldn't have been more wrong. The reason I'm telling you this story, Morrison, is because leadership positions in the military will require you to make similar decisions.
You'll be responsible for the lives and welfare of the soldiers under your command." She pulled out a document from her folder and placed it on the desk between them. "This is a commendation letter from that operation in Afghanistan. It details the actions I took and their results." Jake glanced at the document and saw official letterhead and multiple signatures, but Sarah continued speaking before he could read the details. "If you choose to pursue officer candidate school or other leadership training, you'll be preparing yourself to face the same kinds of decisions I faced that day. The question you need to ask yourself is whether you're ready for that level of responsibility." Jake felt a profound shift in his understanding of what military leadership actually meant. It wasn't about commanding respect through strength or intimidation. It was about earning trust through selfless service and the willingness to sacrifice for others. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I understand now why my early comments were so inappropriate. I had no idea what kind of service member you are or what you've sacrificed for others." Sarah nodded. "Your comments weren't inappropriate because they hurt my feelings, Morrison. They were inappropriate because they reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service represents." She gestured toward the training grounds visible through her window. "Every person on this base has volunteered to serve something larger than themselves. That service sometimes requires sacrifice, and those sacrifices should be honored, not mocked." Jake felt the full weight of this lesson settling in his mind. He realized that his transformation during basic training had been about much more than learning to follow orders or work with a team. It had been about understanding the deeper meaning of service and sacrifice. "If you decide to pursue advanced training and leadership responsibilities," Sarah continued, "you'll be following in the footsteps of countless service members who have made similar sacrifices throughout our military history." She stood up, signaling that their meeting was drawing to a close. "Take some time to consider these opportunities, Morrison. Discuss them with your fellow recruits and your family. This is a decision that will shape the rest of your military career and possibly your entire life." As Jake prepared to leave, he felt compelled to say something more. "Captain Mitchell," he began, "I want you to know that you've changed my entire understanding of what it means to be a soldier. I came here thinking it was about individual strength and toughness, but you've shown me it's really about service and sacrifice." Sarah smiled slightly. "That's exactly the lesson we hoped you would learn, Morrison. The fact that you understand it now tells me you're ready for whatever challenges lie ahead." As Jake left the administrative building, his mind was racing with thoughts about his future and the responsibilities that might await him. The conversation had fundamentally changed his perspective on military leadership and his own potential role in the armed forces. More importantly, it had given him a deeper appreciation for Captain Mitchell and all the other service members who had made similar sacrifices throughout their careers. The graduation ceremony was still several weeks away, but Jake already knew that his time at Fort Harrison had transformed him in ways he never could have imagined. However, there was still more to learn about Captain Mitchell's background, and the upcoming graduation ceremony would provide revelations that would surprise even Jake's newly enlightened perspective on military service. The day of graduation arrived with all the pomp and ceremony befitting the completion of military basic training. Fort Harrison had been transformed for the occasion, with reviewing stands, ceremonial decorations, and space for hundreds of family members who had traveled from across the country to witness their loved ones' transition from civilian to soldier. Jake Morrison stood in formation with his fellow recruits, wearing his dress uniform with pride and precision. The transformation from the arrogant young man who had mocked Captain Mitchell's scars to the dedicated soldier he had become was complete. But even Jake himself couldn't have predicted the final revelation that awaited him. The graduating class had been arranged in perfect formation on the parade ground, with families and distinguished visitors occupying the bleachers that had been set up for the occasion. Among the visitors were several high-ranking military officers, whose presence added gravity and importance to the ceremony. Captain Mitchell stood with the other training instructors, reviewing the recruits she had helped shape over the previous months. Her satisfaction was evident as she observed their bearing and professionalism. This group had faced significant challenges, but they had emerged as competent soldiers, ready to serve their country. The ceremony began with the traditional military honors, including the presentation of colors and the playing of the national anthem. Jake felt a surge of emotion as he listened to the familiar melody, understanding for the first time what it truly meant to serve the flag and the nation it represented. Colonel Harrison, the base commander,
served as the reviewing officer for the ceremony. He was a distinguished veteran with over 25 years of service, and his presence alone commanded respect from everyone present. As Colonel Harrison approached the podium to deliver the graduation address, Jake noticed that several additional high-ranking officers had joined the platform. Among them was a three-star general whose presence seemed to have created a stir among the instructors and administrative staff. Ladies and gentlemen, families, and most importantly, our graduating soldiers. Colonel Harrison began, today marks the completion of one of the most challenging phases of military service. He gestured toward the formation of recruits standing at attention before him. These young men and women arrived here 12 weeks ago as civilians. They leave today as soldiers, prepared to serve our nation with honor and distinction. Jake felt pride swelling in his chest as the colonel spoke about their achievements and transformation. Their training has been rigorous and demanding, designed to test not only their physical capabilities but their character, integrity, and commitment to service. Colonel Harrison paused, looking out over the formation of new soldiers. They have been guided by some of the finest instructors and officers in our military. Individuals who have demonstrated through their own service the values we expect our soldiers to embody. He turned toward the group of instructors standing nearby. Today, I want to recognize one of those instructors in particular, someone whose service record exemplifies the courage and sacrifice that define our military. Jake felt a strange anticipation as he wondered who would be singled out for special recognition. Captain Sarah Mitchell has served as a training instructor here at Fort Harrison for the past year, but her contributions to our military extend far beyond her teaching duties. Jake's attention became completely focused as Colonel Harrison continued speaking about Captain Mitchell. Captain Mitchell's service in Afghanistan represents some of the finest traditions of American military heroism and leadership under fire. The colonel gestured for Captain Mitchell to step forward, which she did with characteristic professionalism and humility. Many of you may not be aware of Captain Mitchell's full service record, but today provides an appropriate opportunity to share some details of her extraordinary contributions to our military mission overseas. Jake found himself holding his breath as he anticipated what would be revealed about his former antagonist and current role model. Captain Mitchell served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, during which she led numerous successful operations against enemy forces in some of the most dangerous regions of that country. The colonel's voice took on a tone of deep respect as he continued recounting Sarah's achievements. Her leadership and tactical skills were instrumental in disrupting enemy supply lines, protecting coalition bases, and conducting successful rescue operations that saved dozens of American and Allied lives. Jake began to realize that the story Captain Mitchell had told him about her scars was only a small part of her overall military record. However, Captain Mitchell's most notable achievement came during a particularly dangerous mission in Helmand Province, where her unit was tasked with conducting a high-risk rescue operation behind enemy lines. The colonel paused, allowing the gravity of his words to resonate with the audience. The operation required infiltrating an enemy-controlled area to extract wounded soldiers from a compound that was under heavy attack. The mission was considered so dangerous that it was classified as a near-suicide operation. Jake felt his understanding of Captain Mitchell's background expanding exponentially as Colonel Harrison continued. Despite the extreme risks involved, Captain Mitchell volunteered to lead the rescue team personally. Her tactical planning and leadership under fire resulted in the successful extraction of all wounded personnel without the loss of a single American life. The colonel gestured toward the 3-star general who had joined the ceremony. I would now like to introduce General Robert Crawford, who commanded the regional forces in Afghanistan during Captain Mitchell's service there. General Crawford stepped forward to address the audience, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone present. Thank you, Colonel Harrison, the general began. I requested permission to attend today's ceremony specifically to recognize Captain Mitchell's exceptional service and to share with you the details of her most significant achievement. Jake realized that whatever was coming would be far more substantial than anything he had previously understood about Captain Mitchell's background. During her final tour in Afghanistan, Captain Mitchell earned a call sign that became legendary among special operations forces throughout the region. The general's words sent a chill through Jake as he began to suspect that Captain Mitchell's true military identity was far more significant than anyone had realized.
Her call sign was Phoenix, earned through her ability to successfully complete missions that others considered impossible, and her talent for bringing her soldiers home safely from the most dangerous operations. Jake felt his worldview shifting once again as he processed this revelation. Captain Mitchell hadn't just been a competent soldier who had been wounded in combat. She had been an elite special operations leader. The rescue operation in Helmand Province that resulted in Captain Mitchell's injuries was just one of dozens of successful high-risk missions she led during her combat deployments. General Crawford looked directly at the formation of graduating recruits. Phoenix became known throughout the special operations community as an officer who never left anyone behind, regardless of the personal risks involved. The general's voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed Captain Mitchell's capabilities firsthand. Her tactical innovations and leadership techniques are now taught in advanced military schools throughout our armed forces. Jake felt a profound sense of awe as he realized that he had been trained by someone who was considered a legend among elite military units. The injuries that Captain Mitchell sustained during that final rescue operation ended her combat career, but they occurred because she chose to shield a wounded soldier with her own body rather than seek cover for herself. General Crawford gestured toward Captain Mitchell, who remained standing at attention with characteristic humility despite the extraordinary praise being heaped upon her. For her actions during that operation and her overall service record, Captain Mitchell was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Valor, and the Purple Heart. The general paused, allowing the significance of these decorations to register with the audience. More importantly, the soldiers she led during her 3 combat tours consider her the finest officer they ever served under. Her call sign Phoenix represents her ability to rise above any challenge and bring others with her. Jake felt tears forming in his eyes as he finally understood the true magnitude of the person he had once mocked for her scars. Today, Captain Mitchell continues to serve our military by training the next generation of soldiers, passing on the values and skills that made her one of our most decorated combat leaders. As General Crawford concluded his remarks, the entire audience rose in spontaneous applause for Captain Mitchell. The ovation continued for several minutes, with family members, fellow officers, and graduating recruits, all recognizing the extraordinary service being honored. Jake applauded with particular intensity, remembering his initial ignorant comments about her qualifications, and feeling profound gratitude for the patience and wisdom she had shown in guiding his transformation. When the applause finally subsided, Captain Mitchell was invited to address the graduating recruits. She approached the podium with the same quiet confidence she had displayed throughout their training. "Thank you for those kind words, General Crawford and Colonel Harrison," she began. "However, I want to emphasize that the real heroes are the soldiers who serve on the front lines every day, putting their lives at risk to protect our nation and our allies." Her voice carried clearly across the parade ground as she addressed the new soldiers. The call sign Phoenix was never about my individual achievements. It was about the collective efforts of the outstanding soldiers I had the privilege to lead and serve alongside. She looked out over the formation of graduating recruits, her eyes briefly meeting Jake's. "Each of you now has the opportunity to begin your own journey of service and sacrifice. Some of you will face challenges and dangers that you cannot yet imagine." Jake hung on every word, understanding that he was receiving guidance from someone whose experience and wisdom were beyond anything he had previously comprehended. Remember that true strength comes not from avoiding danger or difficulty, but from facing it with courage and determination while protecting those who serve beside you. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the entire formation. "The scars we bear, whether visible or invisible, are not signs of failure. They are evidence of our willingness to sacrifice for others and for the values we hold dear." Her words carried special meaning for Jake, who had learned this lesson through his own painful experience of growth and transformation. As you begin your military careers, I encourage you to approach every challenge with humility, every mission with dedication, and every fellow soldier with respect. Captain Mitchell concluded her remarks and stepped back from the podium, leaving Jake and his fellow graduates with wisdom that would guide them throughout their service. As the ceremony concluded with the formal graduation of the recruit class, Jake felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in his own achievement was overshadowed by profound respect for the woman who had guided his transformation from arrogant recruit to dedicated soldier.
When the formal festivities ended and families began reuniting with their newly graduated soldiers, Jake made his way through the crowd toward Captain Mitchell. "Captain," he said as he approached her, "I wanted to thank you for everything you've taught me, and to apologize once more for my inappropriate comments during our first week of training." Sarah turned toward him with a genuine smile. "Morrison, your apology was accepted months ago. What matters now is the soldier you've become and the service you'll provide going forward." Jake nodded, but felt compelled to say more. "Ma'am, if I had known about your background and your service record, I never would have made those comments." Sarah's expression became more serious. "Morrison, that's exactly the wrong lesson to take from this experience." Jake looked confused, unsure what she meant. "You shouldn't respect me because of my decorations or my call sign," she explained. "You should respect all service members because of their willingness to serve, regardless of their rank or their combat record." She gestured toward the other instructors and graduating recruits around them. "Every person here has volunteered to serve something greater than themselves. That commitment alone deserves your respect, regardless of what else they may have achieved." Jake nodded, understanding that Captain Mitchell was teaching him one final lesson about military values and the importance of treating all service members with dignity. "I understand now that respect should be based on character and commitment, not on rank or recognition." Sarah smiled approvingly. "That's exactly right, Morrison. That understanding will serve you well throughout your military career." As Jake prepared to leave Fort Harrison and begin the next phase of his military service, he reflected on the incredible journey he had experienced over the previous 12 weeks. He had arrived as an arrogant young man who thought he understood strength and leadership. He was leaving as a soldier who had learned the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and respect for others. Most importantly, he had been privileged to learn these lessons from someone whose own service exemplified the highest ideals of military dedication and heroism. Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell had not only transformed Jake from a problematic recruit into a dedicated soldier, but she had also demonstrated, through her own example, what it truly meant to serve with honor and distinction. As Jake walked toward the bus that would take him to his next assignment, he carried with him lessons that would shape not only his military career, but his entire approach to life and service to others. The scars he had once mocked had indeed told a story, but it was a story far more inspiring and heroic than his limited understanding could have ever imagined.